With the release of Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania kicking off Marvel's Phase 5, it seems as good a time as any to take a look back at Phase 4 and ask, what the hell was all that about? By the way, I am very well aware of the irony of Marvel holding back on the movie featuring an invasion of hyper-intelligent alien ants until after they'd finished Phase 4. As usual, when we deal with a highly charged pop culture franchise, it's worth stressing that In the Frame is not a review show. If you want to check out our reviews of all the individual films in Phase 4, they're available at a quick Google. We're much more interested in trying to figure out what exactly was going on, playing out through this expansive and somewhat convoluted series of interlocking films and television shows. In pop music, there's a concept known as the Imperial Phase. Defined by former music critic, current Pet Shop Boy, and perpetual snazzy dresser Neil Tennant, a band goes through an imperial phase at the height of their creative and commercial success. It's the moment at which an artist can do no wrong. They can get away with anything. Audiences will follow them anywhere and to anything. Although the term originated in music criticism, it applies to other art forms as well. Phase 3 was Marvel's Imperial Phase. The 11 films on that release slate, running 3 years from May 2016 to July 2019, grossed a combined $13.5 billion. Of the 6 films that the studio released between Thor Ragnarok in November 2017 and Black Widow in July 2021, only one grossed less than $1 billion. Previously C or even D-list heroes like Black Panther or Captain Marvel were able to ride this wave to record-breaking grosses. The wave crested with Avengers Endgame, which was briefly the highest-grossing movie of all time, unadjusted for inflation. However, critic Tom Ewing has noted that there was always something double-edged about the concept of an Imperial Phase. As Ewing mused, it holds a mix of world-conquering swagger and inevitable obsolescence. What do we know about emperors? That they end up naked. The phase always ends. Or as Tennant's fellow Pet Shop Boy and sunglass enthusiast Chris Lowe more bluntly put it means that you can do what you like, usually followed by disappearing up your backside. At the end of Phase 3, the heroes of the Marvel Cinematic Universe have defeated the Mad Titan Thanos, named by his creator Jim Starlin for the Greek concept of Thanatos, meaning death. By the end of Endgame, our heroes have restored half of all life in the universe, mastered time and space to such an extent that Steve Rogers can return home to his sweetheart, and even managed to somewhat rehabilitate Thor: The Dark World. Is there nothing they cannot do? Marvel Studios was in a similar position itself. Just over a decade earlier, the company had inherited a slate that featured a bunch of leftover third-rate characters that the publisher couldn't option to other studios. Now they'd managed to turn a 3-hour epic featuring a talking raccoon, a version of Tinky Wink who had really cut himself shaving, and Black Hat star Chris Hemsworth into the biggest movie of all time, the crowning accomplishment of Disney's 2019, which was itself the best year that any studio had ever had. What more could Marvel want or hope to accomplish?
And when Alexander saw the breadth of his domain, he wept, for there were no more worlds to conquer.
Whether consciously or subconsciously, this is the central tension of Phase 4. The MCU has proven itself. It has accomplished everything that a movie franchise could ever want to do. There's something fundamentally existential about all this. In the grand tradition of comic book legends Stan Lee and Jack Kirby's Fantastic Four, Eternals is a movie about our heroes fighting and vanquishing God. To be a credible threat, the villain of Thor: Love and Thunder has to kill literal gods. Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness features a bearded mystic transforming water into wine at a wedding, in case you don't get the subtext.
A little too on the nose.
Not for you at my wedding? Nah, I think it was perfect.
However, due to the demands of capitalism, the studio was not only forced to continue, but to exceed its past performance. It's thrown into competition, not with alternate failed shared universe experiments like the DCEU or the Dark Universe, but instead with its own past self. This may explain why Phase 4 is dominated by doppelgangers and duplicates, characters who discover that their greatest enemies are alternate versions of themselves. Whether a robot built from Vision's dead body, mass-produced subjects of the same experiment that created Black Widow, a rival Captain America, a seemingly infinite number of Lokis, Mark and Steven at war over their body, alternate Wandas and Stevens. It's telling that the upcoming big bad, Kang the Conqueror, is a dude with infinite versions of himself. Kevin Feige might insist that superhero fatigue isn't a thing, but watching Phase 4 can often feel like the real threat in the MCU is the fact that there are too many interchangeable superheroes.
This is a nightmare.
Having conquered the world, the MCU needs to expand. It faces that existential crisis of any imperial power, grow or die. Within the fictional world, this manifests through the concept of the multiverse, which presents a seemingly infinite array of options, but which always seem to come down to the same limited possibilities and often act as a gateway to tie in nostalgia from studios either acquired by or working in cooperation with Disney. There's always more, but somehow it's always more of things you already know. Outside the narrative, it comes from the universe expanding from film into streaming and television. Marvel Studios has found new worlds to conquer. WandaVision is the story about the MCU establishing a beachhead into television, with the early episodes borrowing the formal language of decades of sitcom history, only to bend them to the standard computer-generated climax of a typical Marvel movie. There's a new generation of heroes introduced, but they're mostly tied to ones that we already know. Another Black Panther, another Marvel, another Thor, another Cap, another Widow, and somehow, inexplicably, we have 2 Hawkeyes. This gets at another existential crisis, something that the MCU has understood to be coming since at least Age of Ultron. In comics, characters can continue in perpetuity. Peter Parker has been a teenager and a 20-something for 60 years because he's a character drawn on a page. Comics exist in a perpetual now. Film and television don't. Actors age out, move on, and die. Stories end. In most cases, franchises just reboot and start over, whether softly or hardly. Okay, and quick sidebar here because I may need to explain that Age of Ultron reference. Age of Ultron is a dysfunctional movie in many senses, in large part because it's caught between being a comic book adaptation and a feature film in its own right. It's caught between that tension of stories that end, like movies, and stories that continue forever, like comic books. It is in many ways a story about thwarted parenthood. There's a central recurring motif of monstrous reproduction, most obviously with Tony creating Ultron, but also with the Avengers creating Vision, but also in the discussion that Bruce and Natasha have about how neither of them can have children. You also have Ultron talking about the horrors of children and reproduction, that children represent the end of the self, they represent death, because they represent the part of an individual that continues on beyond one's mortality, which means confronting one's mortality. You also have the central argument at the farm, which consists of Steve and Tony arguing about what kind of franchise they want it to be. Steve is a soldier, he believes that there is always a war to be fought. In contrast, Tony is an engineer. He believes that there are problems that can be fixed. If a war is to be fought, the point is to end the war. There must be an end to this. The Avengers must be this thing that ends. This is the fundamental tension of Age of Ultron, and it's a circle that the movie can't square. Is it a movie, in which case it has to have an ending, or is it a comic book story in which it can never have an ending? How do you reconcile those two things? Age of Ultron is frustrating because it can't answer its own question, but it's compelling because it dares to ask it. End sidebar. The MCU is too successful to attempt even a soft reboot, and so finds itself caught in a space where many of its older actors are either gone or pushing themselves to the margins, while introducing new blood to potentially replace them. But the MCU is afraid to let go of its older characters, even bring back sound-alikes in the animated What If, and so can't let its newer characters take the spotlight, even in movies that have nothing to do with Steve and Tony, who've been gone for 4 years at this point. Characters seem mandated to be talking about Steve and Tony.
So now that Captain Rogers and Iron Man are both gone, who do you think is going to lead the Avengers?
Very few franchises get to run at this level of popularity for this long. In some ways, Phase 4 feels like the MCU working through a midlife crisis, to the point that several of the films are actually about characters taking their power for granted, but working through more complicated and existential questions about who they are. This is a pretty significant recurring plot point in Multiverse of Madness.
Are you happy?
That's a interesting question.
It's also the starting point of Thor's character arc in Love and Thunder.
But beneath his god bod, there was still a sad bod just trying to get out.
Hell, it's central to understanding Loki's arc in, well, Loki.
What exactly is it that you want? I want you to be honest about why you do what you do.
It's an identity crisis. Part of it is tied to the success that came before, but also to uncertainty about what will follow. After all, it isn't just the actors growing older, it's the audience. The largest cinema-going audience in the States is the 14 to 34-year-old demographic. A kid who saw Iron Man at age 14 in 2008 is now approaching 29 and dangerously close to aging out of that audience, which presents a challenge. Who are these movies and television shows for? Are they for that aging original audience? or for a newer and younger demographic? Phase 4 can only clumsily gesture at an answer. This chapter of the shared universe is inordinately interested in the stories of parents and children. Of course, superhero stories have often been about parents and children, even earlier chapters of the MCU. However, those stories always assumed audience identification with the younger characters in the dynamic, initially rebelling against their stern and out-of-touch parental figures, and then, as the franchise and characters grew up, later reconciling with them.
I know we failed you, but we can make this right.
I failed you.
In contrast, the audience identification figures in Phase 4 are the heroes who find themselves becoming parents, whether literally or figuratively. Again, there are roots of this in earlier phases, like the Guardians protecting baby Groot during Guardians 2, or Tony becoming a surrogate father to Peter in Homecoming, but it's a much larger scale shift, and it's consistently foregrounded within the narratives of Phase 4. This just reflects demographics. A couple that went on their first date to see Iron Man could easily be taking their young child to see Wakanda Forever. Those three people, or more, present an interesting audience dynamic. And one of the big tensions of Phase 4 is that it's never entirely sure which audience it's prioritizing. Are these movies for the parents or the kids? Movies can serve both audiences, of course, but they need to decide which takes priority. Phase 4 is the story of a company trapped by its own success, and unable to imagine a clear path forwards because it's already on top of the world. Since the only possible direction is down, these movies and shows find the company shifting in place, working through deep-set anxieties and grappling with opponents that can't be defeated by a series of color-coded energy blasts in a computer-generated climax. There is no path forwards, so the trick is to move in circles and shimmy sideways to open the door to a multiverse of infinite reflections and echoes, copies and clones. If Phase 3 was Marvel's Imperial phase, then Phase 4 was peak Marvel. The studio released more content in 2021 and 2022 than it had in the previous 13 years combined, and yet the numbers were down. In 2021, all the studio's solo productions were outperformed by Sony's Venom: Let There Be Carnage. The only movie in Phase 4 to earn more than $1 billion was No Way Home, which was actually distributed by Sony. The studio landed some of its worst reviews to that point with releases like Eternals. Just as Quantumania opened Phase 5, the studio announced that it would pull back on the number of releases. The studio will only release 2 streaming shows in 2023, down from the 4 that it had planned. The Marvels was pushed back from a competitive July weekend to a less crowded November space. The Imperial phase was over. The peak had been passed. Phase 4 began with Marvel looking for purpose on top of the world. Phase 5 begins with the studio facing an uphill climb. I've been Darren Mooney, and this was In the Frame.